This episode of the World War II podcast is brought to you by Hillsdale. For exclusive access to their new course, Winston Churchill and Statesmanship, go to hillsdale.edu/WW2podcast. Hello and welcome to another World War II podcast. I'm Angus Wallace. In today's episode, we'll be looking at the de Havilland Mosquito. It was fast, extremely versatile and made from wood, affectionately referred to as the Mossie. Over 7,000 were built, yet only 2 remain flying today. I'm joined by John Lilly, Ross Sharp and Nick Horrox. They are from the People's Mosquito, a project aiming to get another Mossie flying. John is the chairman and managing director, Ross is the director of engineering and Nick is communications. Thank you for joining me, gentlemen. I wonder if we should start with the specification that kicked it all off in 1936. What was the aviation ministry looking for? Ross, do you want to kick us off?
They were looking for a twin-engine bomber that would carry a 3,000-pound bomb load to Berlin. The maximum speed is somewhere between 250 and 300 miles an hour. Now, out of that specification came eventually the Manchester and the Halifax. But the real crucial thing is the Air Ministry was locked in to having large bombers with gun turrets to defend themselves, and that meant large metal bombers. There was only one company that was still had the capacity and the will to build in wood, and that was de Havilland.
Why did Geoffrey de Havilland come up? I mean, because it's a slightly different specification. He came up with the idea of a very fast, unarmoured wooden bomber.
Actually, not quite so. His original reply to that 1936 specification was a modified version of the DH-91 Albatross airliner with gun turrets. And then he worked out that, wait a minute, if we take the turrets out, it'll be so much lighter and so much faster. And if we put 2 Merlins in, wait a minute, the wetted area of that aircraft, that means the area that's exposed to the airstream, will only be about 40% bigger than a Spitfire. It's got twice the engine power of a Spitfire. It should be around about 20 miles an hour as an unarmed bomber than a Spitfire was, which would make it the fastest warplane in the world.
And what was the Air Ministry's response to an unarmed bomber?
Their response was rather like, you said what? There was one saving grace. Air Marshal Sir Wilfrid Freeman was heading up the research section, the Royal Air Force, or the Air Ministry at that stage, and he was a big proponent of this idea. So much so, he was fighting his colleagues. It actually became known inside the Royal Air Force as Freeman's Folly. He was in Sir Geoffrey de Havilland's corner right from day one, and it was a huge internal sell. As a matter of fact, the only reason the Mosquito got built to specification B1/40B was because Sir Wilfrid's powers as a head of research gave him the ability to order one aircraft for research purposes. And it wasn't until that specification was added to and rewritten that the Mossie was first ordered in its first batch of 50. But it was Sir Wilfrid Freeman pushing the rest of the air staff that still fought against him and ended up with schemes for putting gun turrets on a Mosquito, and there are mock-ups existing of that. It was quite bizarre. But Sir Geoffrey and the team persisted, and that's how we ended up with the aircraft. The real crux of the Mosquito is you shouldn't regard it as a wooden aircraft. Really, it's the world's first successful composite aircraft. That's because you take a 3-ply skin of birch plywood and you stretch it over a mahogany mold. Into 6 slots, you then slot bulkheads that are pre-shaped of ply and spruce, and then you work along the mold, laying in pieces of spruce and other woods where necessary for strengthening purposes. You then fill in the gaps with balsa wood, 3/8 inch of balsa wood, and put another layer of plywood, birch ply, over the top. You've saturated, meanwhile, the whole of the interior of this with a casein glue, which is a phosphoprotein derived from milk, added to sodium hydroxide, slaked lime, and water to make a natural glue, in effect. And then you pressurize that by putting steel strapping over the whole thing, and it fuses it, in effect, into an 11 millimeter thick, flexible yet rigid fuselage shell, like a half shell, rather like half of a Kinder Egg. And you build two of these side by side, and then you mate them. So it's more like what we do now with laying up pre-preg and in the carbon fiber in a mold. It's the same sort of idea. It's more like a composite structure than a plain wooden one.
Did a wooden structure give it any benefits over...
Goodness, almost innumerable. First of all, wood is regarded as being flammable. Well, strangely enough, there are many instances of mosquitoes being hit, and the progress of fire, shall we say, taking a lot longer than in metal aircraft. Secondly, if you wanted to, say, repair a Spitfire, you'd need some, say it had been damaged in the wing by flak. It's a fairly rigorous process. It's a stress monocoque shell, and the repair processes are more difficult. In Mossies, you just sawed the damaged section off and butt jointed a new one on. Repairs were much faster. It's an absolutely fabulous gun platform. Why? If you fit it with heavy cannon, and the Mosquito design team intended that to happen from day one, when you fire, then the wooden suspension beams that hold the 20 millimeter cannon in the belly of the aircraft absorb the vibration much better than metal components would. Plus, as Nick will probably tell you, you tapped into a whole mass of woodworkers, carpenters, cabinet makers that were being underutilized in World War II Britain. It didn't involve highly skilled metal engineers, lathe production, etc. You could mock up pieces and fit them much easier. Plus, one big thing. The wood as used, and let's take the Canadian yellow spruce that we use for the fabricated wood spars and other components, has the same ultimate tensile strength, around about 60 newtons per millimeter squared, than comparable aluminium alloys of the time or certain steels. It might be thicker in section, but you get the same UTS. So it's a strong material as well.
Was there ever a problem with supplying the wood? Because they, as you say, it's coming from Canada, and is it Ecuador?
Ecuador for the balsa, British Columbia for the Canadian yellow spruce, elm and ash from England, of course. Walnut was used, not just to make tables with, but actually for the wing root fittings, where its great strength was of use too. Ash was used for its durability. There was a slight difficulty when you you established mosquito production in Australia, because you couldn't get some of the woods. So they had to substitute native-grown boxwood for some of the wood functions out there.
So how did this work if you're subcontracting to smaller woodworkers? Because the production process was not a huge production line that you might see with some of the metalworking plants, were they? They were subcontracting out parts to other woodworking. Actually,
there were large production lines, and so much so that they disrupted the rest of the de Havilland's business. They had to move Tiger Moth production out to Morris Motors at Coventry. They moved the de Havilland Dragon Repeat production out to Brush Electrics at Loughborough. There still wasn't enough room. So they set up a relationship with the Standard Motor Group to actually set up a whole new production line for mosquitoes up there. And they built over 1,000 mosquitoes out of the 7,700 and odd that were built. They also set up what was known as the Second Aircraft Group, which is a conglomeration of factories centered on Leavesden, about 12 miles away from the original factory. And they built mosquitoes too. Also Percival's at Luton, and Airspeed down in the Southampton area. And even then it wasn't enough, because the Canadians had to get involved, and they built their own mosquitoes. down, and the Australians did too.
Did it ever become almost a problem that it was trying to use woodworkers who were underutilized, and you have this fantastically successful aircraft? Did they struggle to get woodworkers in the end, feeding in and wood and everything else? Because it was a very successful aircraft.
I don't think so. You did subcontract down to a very remarkably low level. There are photographs in extant of groups of people around kitchen tables assembling small components, outworkers who would literally put together small components and sub-assemblies, and they'd be collected by a van, presumably, and taken back to, say, something like the 2nd Aircraft Group. This aided the entry of, say, women into the workforce. You also needed people with nimble fingers, and in some cases, even people of small stature, to actually penetrate right to the end. When you join the two halves of the fuselage together, when they've fitted out, there's a V-notch and joint that comes together like that with the two halves of the fuselage. Then there's a rebate, a strip of wood on top of that, which is nailed all the way to the end of the fuselage. And you actually needed somebody of fairly small stature to get in towards where it became the fuselage, the tail end became very, very small, to actually complete that task all the way to the end.
We've touched upon the design. I mean, it was a multi-role aircraft, but it comes out ultimately, but it comes out of this specification for a medium bomber. So when they designed it, did they design a bomber, or did they design just a plane? And then it turned out that as the war went on, they thought, well, it'll take a bit more of this, and we can do that, and we can change this, and we can.
Well, the design team was quite forward-looking right from day one. They had said that we're building a medium bomber, but there will be space underneath the cockpit floor for 4 20mm cannon, which was a very heavy armament for the day. They always envisaged it as having fighter speed and fighter maneuverability and fighter punch. But the Air Force didn't even want that. It didn't even want the bomber. The only reason it was allowed to be built initially was they needed a very fast photo reconnaissance aircraft. And that was the first aircraft, the first type that actually undertook the first operational flight. It's 11 months after the first one. Number 1 PRU at Benson, as it became. And that initial sortie was abortive. Unfortunately, there was a camera failure. But nevertheless, that was the first flight that any Mosquito made operationally, a photo reconnaissance sortie. Strangely enough, by a quirk of fate, the very last flight that a Mosquito made in Royal Air Force service was a photo reconnaissance sortie. So, yeah, bookended by photo reconnaissance. But in between, everything you name, bomber, night fighter, day fighter, PR, maritime strike, a navalized fighter, you name it, just the whole unarmed transport as well. Mustn't forget that.
How did the unarmed transport work? Because it's only a 2-seater plane.
There was a need for the UK to communicate with Stockholm. Stockholm was a great source of ball bearings, and also, as a neutral country, it was a great source for espionage material and recovering escaped prisoners of war and other things. And they did this initially by using Lockheed Lodestars and other aircraft from Lucas in Scotland. A very risky run to Stockholm. When the Mosquito came along, they realized, oh, this will work nicely. So they de-armed some Mosquitoes, demilitarized them, issued them to BOAC, gave them civilian registrations, manned them with BOAC crews, and as to carry a third person, they actually modified the bomb bay and put in a sort of a temporary resting couch, mattresses, and supplied the passenger who was wearing flight suit with oxygen, a reading light, reading material, flask of coffee, sandwiches, etc., and ferried them backwards and forwards across to Sweden. And there were some quite important people went there, backwards and forwards. Niels Bohr, the Danish physicist who worked on the nuclear bomb, was evacuated from Stockholm to the UK in a Mosquito. So Malcolm Sargent, the young Malcolm Sargent, the conductor, went backwards and forwards to conduct an orchestra in Stockholm in a Mosquito.
I'm guessing its actual strength, all right, at 2 million engines, it's fast. But how fast is it if we compare it to anything else that was in the air at the time? How fast was it?
For 18 months in the middle of the war, it was the fastest aircraft in the world. United States Air Force pilots who flew P-38 Lightnings were told not to try and outrun a Mosquito and race with it. Right? Humiliation ensued. Simple as that. Fastest Mosquito in excess of 435 miles an hour. It held its own at the end of the war against Me-262 jets, the photoreconnaissance version, just by outmaneuvering them and outlasting them, because the early generation jets didn't have the range and duration. And they also take a tremendous pounding if they were caught in the gun sight of 262. So, yeah, an utterly amazing aircraft.
And what was the ceiling of them? How high could they go?
The later pressurized bomber versions could reach over 30,000 feet. There were certain Mosquitoes that could go even higher. For example, in 1941, I believe, as far as 42, certain versions of the Junkers 86 reconnaissance bomber were coming over the UK in excess of 40,000 feet, completely unreachable by the Spitfires that were extant at the time. And inside 7 days, the Havillands had modified a Mosquito, extended the wingtips, installed more powerful engines, pressurized the cockpit, installed a gun pack, installed initially 4 303 Browning machine guns, because the Ju-86Ps were pressurized but unarmed, and put in smaller, lighter wheels, etc. Lots of fixes. And these things would reach 43,000 feet.
It almost conjures up the idea of that someone comes up with a need, and somebody in the shed gets his saw and his hammer out and adjusts something to fit a new piece of equipment in, or because they could carry radar as well, didn't they, on the Pathfinder missions? Obo.
To answer that question, Angus, I think it was a case of the guys in de Havilland reacting to requirements, and quite quickly, as Ross said, within 7 days in the Mark 15. Was that the case, Ross?
Yes, absolutely.
Presumably, if it was a metal construction, you would have a lot of problems refabricating little parts and changing struts and other bits and pieces, whereas presumably with the wood, you could literally cut a piece out and fit a G-piece in very quickly. To me, growing up, the defining role of the Mosquito, and I might be wrong here, is the Pathfinder, the role they had as with the Pathfinders. I wonder if you could briefly tell us about the Pathfinder, how it worked for the Pathfinders. I don't know if they used anything else other than the Mosquitoes. I presume they must have done.
Yes, they did, actually. Leonard Cheshire used, I believe it, on a Mustang at night to mark with. Pathfinder Force was established eventually as number 8 group, but number 5 group of Bomber Command had their own Pathfinder technique and their own Pathfinder Squadron 627 on Mosquitoes. Pathfinding evolved because, sadly to say, initial bombing surveys, the early part of the war, 1940-41, showed that the majority of bombs didn't fall closer than 3 miles away from the target. That's because they're using dead reckoning to actually establish their position over Germany. And it wasn't until the advent of G, which utilized a series of signals to enable the navigator to set up grid lines as to where they were, which would reach out as far as the Ruhr until the Germans jammed it. Then other systems, such as Oboe, which was far more accurate and was never successfully jammed by the Germans, was set up. And the Mosquito was ideal for this because most of the main force bombed at around 16,000 feet. The Mosquito could easily reach 23,000, 24,000 feet. It was line of sight, so the higher up you are, the further the range you've got for the signal as an aircraft. And the Mossies were ideal for this. They would usually, say, your relative Lancaster would take off approximately 2 hours before the Mosquito Pathfinders would take off. Mosquitoes would then overtake them, mark the target, as well as using pyrotechnics to mark the target. They always filled the bomb bay up with the odd 500-pounder if they had one left. So they'd just stoke up a target for the main force to see.
If you compare the Mosquito to the B-17, I think a lot of people in their mind think the B-17 is like a Lancaster, and it's not. It had a much smaller payload, which was not dissimilar to the Mosquito. And the Mosquito, in theory, could deliver about the same amount. I mean, you must have heard this before. This Mosquito could deliver about the same tonnage of bombs on Berlin as a B-17 and get there in half the time. Why did they not use more Mosquitoes for these sort of bombing runs? Or was it just impractical?
Do you want to comment on that one, Nick?
Well, politics.
Well done, that man.
It's an argument we hear all the time.
Nick's got it right. Politics in one. Absolutely.
To answer your question on the bomb bay load, it was after the advent of the Mark 16, B Mark 16 Mosquito, where the bomb bay was enlarged. So the bulge bomb bay, almost like had a guppy look to it as well. So the later mid-war to late-war Mosquitoes were carrying then, yes, around 4,000 pounds worth of bombs. More importantly, which is the same payload as the B-17. More importantly, it could also then carry the Cookie, very high explosive bomb, which it caused quite a hell of a lot of damage on installations and things like that. But yeah, Nick is right. The Americans and the British had developed their bomber strategies kind of at the advent or before World War II, and they were committed to, and the Americans especially believed, large formations flying in tight box formations with the fact that they were carrying probably up to, 12, 16, 50 caliber machine guns was an impregnable defense. What de Havilland's proved Mosquito was that speed, a guile and attack could win the day, but on 2 aircrew, not up to 12 aircrew or 10 aircrew, as a lot of these bombers had as well. But, the powers that be didn't really see that really until probably after the war.
The Mosquito could do the run to Berlin twice in a night, which B-17 would find very difficult to do. And that was an important change as well.
Yeah, the 4,000-pound Cookie, it was standard towards the end of the war. Some of the earlier versions of the Mark IV, the B Mark IV Mosquitoes, had the earlier bomb bay, but they would struggle a bit to gain altitude. And that was quite vital earlier on. If you developed an engine problem with a Cookie, you couldn't drop a Cookie safely below 10,000 feet. That's because the blast radius was so large, it would create a crater 100 yards wide and around about 20 yards deep, and there's a chance of you being blown up. There were nose fuses, 3 nose fuses, and they had no tail fins per such. It just looked like a cylinder. The last portion of it is empty for aerodynamic reasons. As John said, and as Nick said, you complete the same aircraft could complete the run to Berlin twice in a night, carrying 4,000 pounds. And there are instances of Mosquitoes completing 100, or even in some 1 or 2 cases, 200 missions successfully. The loss rate in Mosquitoes was minuscule. I think it was something like about 0.87%.
It was the most successful type operated by Bomber Command in terms of loss rate during World War II. And as Ross pointed out earlier as well, Angus, the propensity for it to sustain damage and still get crews home it became very popular with the air crews as well. When a shell or a bullet goes through fuselage, it goes through the other side and exits and stuff, but it'll maintain a very good integrity. There are many photographs that exist on the internet. There's a particularly famous one Ross might recall, where I think they were shooting down V1s, and it exploded in front of them, and it kind of shredded the whole tail and fabric off and everything. But the air crew still were able to land it and bring it home. A bit like the Hurricane as well. The Hurricane got a reputation for taking a lot of battle damage, especially around the fuselage area, because a lot of people don't remember that the Hurricane was kind of like a halfway house between the modern monocoque Spitfire and, guess, World War I era wooden structured aeroplanes as well. There are actual recorded operational sorties where pathfinders and weather recon missions were flying 2 missions a night. You know, they get back, refuel the aircrew, and go back again. The Mosquito not only took up bomber duties, but it was also, Ross will probably lead on here as well, we also started to lead the way with electronic countermeasures as well. And a very famous RAF group, 100 group, was formed kind of like to suppress the enemy air defence. It sounds like I'm talking about the Gulf War here, doesn't it? All these sorts of things. So you can see where modern-day tactics have been formed. And the Mosquito flew a lot of countermeasure raids and also was very heavily involved with not only G, but also using another electronic system called OBO, which was, again, to get the bomber stream exactly more accurately over the target area.
Did the Americans use them?
The United States Air Force, Army Air Corps as it was then, desperately wanted Mosquitoes. Unfortunately, we couldn't spare any. They managed to persuade de Havilland Canada to give them 40, which they renamed as the F-8, modify them with photo reconnaissance, and later Britain allowed them to have some Mark 16 photo reconnaissance aircraft, which they used for weather reconnaissance, they used for target marking, and also a handful of very, very shady operations by the OSS, where they installed a third crew member in the bomb bay, and they used a two-way radio phone system called the Joan Eleanor system to make contact with OSS agents in Germany. And this again was only possible in the Mosquito because it would fly to a height of something like 25,000 feet. And the agent had something that looked rather like a very early clunky mobile phone. And when he spoke into that, he could establish radio contact with an operator in the bomb bay of the Mosquito. Because the radio transmissions came out as a cone, in effect, it can only be detected on the ground at a distance of under 50 feet away. So they couldn't be intercepted by the Gestapo with their radio vans. So it was quite a secure system. And towards the end of the war, that was used to feed immediate intelligence, such as troop movements and battle damage, back to the UK.
They were also fitted with rockets, weren't they? And you mentioned the Hurricane. I hadn't realised the Hurricane was sort of a halfway house in design-wise, because I don't think the Spitfire could take the rockets, but the Hurricane could. Yeah,
the Hurricane was initially known as the Fury monoplane, right? And if you look at it, it looks just like a Hawker Fury. And as John said, there are wooden components behind the cockpit of the Hurricane. There are formers that actually hold the fabric skin of the Hurricane together, and then there's a steel structure that gives it the strength. And 20mm cannon shells will often pass through that and do very little damage. The Hurricane would keep on flying. But because it was that half a generation older than the Spitfire, it couldn't really be developed to give ultimate performance. The Spitfire, by the way, is the only aircraft in World War II to be in constant production from day one, 1939, all the way through to 45. The only aircraft. Other than, on the Allied side, I might say. The ME-109 was still in production. To get back to the Mosquito, rockets, yeah. The idea of using the 3-inch and rifle projectiles on the Mosquito came in relatively early, but not before they'd actually developed something else. I'm sure John and Nick will tell you that one of my favorite versions of the Mosquito is the FB-18, otherwise known as the Setzi. Nick?
Well, this was an aircraft that carried a huge field gun, basically, stuck under the nose. They took a field gun, 6-pounder field gun, replaced the Hispano cannon under the nose with this huge field gun. There was how would you describe the loading?
If you like oddities, this was really odd. a gentleman called Mullins owned a cigarette machine manufacturing company who literally handled cigarettes through the process, a highly automated process of producing them. And he had this idea of modifying this gun, a 6-pounder quick-firing gun. It's 57mm caliber, and using the shells, loading them as he would in a cigarette automated machine. And it worked. It was fabulous. It could fire it at the rate of just about one shell every 1.5 seconds. It carried more than 20 of these shells. It could blow a hole in a U-boat, which it did many times. And the wooden component, they found out it was ideal because it would absorb the vibration better than the metal beams would. It still carried either 2 or 4 machine guns, Angus, for sighting purposes.
When they first fitted the weapon, the RE and the Royal Air Force, the Ministry, were in real troubles because it kept jamming. And the chute mechanism was particularly tight and difficult to engineer and manufacture to get the tolerances right. So Mullins, they reached out into industry, and it was, yes, the Mullins organisation that said, looking at it, went, well, this is a kind of like a similar version to our machinery, as Ross quite rightly said, in the cigarette manufacturing world. And literally within a month, very quickly, they were able to sort it out. So it became an efficient weapon then. The Tetsi Mosquito also carried extra armour as well, and the weight of the gun and the shells did reduce its top speed around about 20 to 30 miles an hour. And what the Coastal Command did now, so now we've got Bomber Command, Fighter Command, Photo Recon, now you're into Coastal Command now. What they did was they found that they could supplement and hunt shipping and U-boats in packs. So they would often operate as a flight or a number of flights operating together. Some of them would be FB6s carrying the 25-pound projectiles, cannons and machine guns, and then literally, they would lay suppressing fire or go after the U-boats or the ships that way, and allowing the Tetsi one to come in and give the kind of killer blow, if you want to call it that. So it was a very highly effective weapon, but they found that eventually the speed and the versatility of the FB6 won the day, and so it wasn't really carried as a type. Although it did exist towards the end of the war, the FB6s were much more a more versatile platform for Coastal Command and Fighter Command as well going forward.
So essentially, the rail rockets replaced the Tetsi gun.
The shipping strike wings of Coastal Command, particularly operating out of Banff under Group Captain Max Aitken, were a formidable organisation. The strikes, mostly on the Norwegian coast, though some into the Baltic, used, as Nick said, the 3-inch rocket projectiles with 2 types of head. Initially, they used the standard 60-pound high explosive head, but they found that it was much more efficient to use the 25-pound solid armor-piercing shot head. Because what that did, it ripped a hole in the hull, smashed up any structures inside, and kept on going, and ripped another hole going out. So the ship literally flooded and sank. And of course, it scattered pieces of burning cordite propellant inside and set fires. So it really was a very efficient weapon. If you used the high explosive head, what you did when you fired all the 8 rocket projectiles together, you got the equivalent of a broadside from a light cruiser. That would really spoil your day.
With underwing tanks as well as the rocket projectiles from the Banff Strike Wing up there in Scotland, the Mosquitoes were a very, very nice extension of the Admiralty's arm, really, or the Air Force in this case, putting out several cruisers there as a mission on a daily basis. And of course, it was also highly effective in Fighter and Bomber Command against locomotives, armoured trains, and also tanks as well. The Typhoon, obviously, very infamous for that, post D-Day, etc., etc.
John mentioned the Typhoon at D-Day. What many people don't realise is there were squadrons from the 2nd Tactical Air Force of the Royal Air Force using Mosquitoes at night, doing the same job as typhoons did during the day. They actually had flare droppers, usually Ferry Albacores, believe it or not, the Royal Navy or other aircraft, dropping flares over Normandy so they could seek out German targets, because the Germans had quickly worked out it was a losing proposition to move by day in Normandy after June the 6th. They would just be attacked by American fighters or British fighters. So they restricted their movements wherever possible to nighttime. And that's where the mosquitoes came in.
They also used them against the Tirpitz, didn't they? They had a pop and failed at the Tirpitz.
They didn't use them against the Tirpitz. The idea was that they were going to use them against the Tirpitz. Number 618 Squadron, who our patron, by the way, trained in using mosquitoes, actually were tasked with using a revolutionary weapon called Highball, which is a smaller version of the upkeep mine used against the dams. Designed by Sir Barnes-Wallis, the Highball you could carry two in tandem in a mosquito, and they were going to be quite deadly against capital ships. And eventually they shipped the whole squadron out to Australia on two escort carriers that departed from the Clyde, and they also sent out a number of FB mosquitoes, so the highly modified versions of the Mark IVs would be not used up in sort of utilization of hours, etc. And they were going to attack the Japanese fleet from the decks of Royal Navy carriers. Unfortunately, as Nick mentioned politics, that didn't sit too well with the United States Navy. So the political wrangling lasted so long that eventually the 618 Squadron was dissolved and disbanded in Australia.
That was due to the atomic weapons being used. There was no cause for the mosquitoes then.
What life did they have after the war? Obviously things were changing very quickly with the introduction of the jet engine.
The last Royal Air Force sortie was in December, 50th of December 1955, from Royal Air Force Seletar, at a reconnaissance sortie over a Malaysian target. They were used in RAF Bomber Command until the advent of the Canberra, circa 1951. But the last use of any mosquitoes in the UK, and please note I say in the UK, was in the early 1960s when number 3 Civilian Anti-Aircraft Corporation Unit from Exeter ran a mix of modified TT-35 mosquitoes and others to provide targets for Army and other units to shoot at, the towed targets.
A lot of those aircraft ended up being stars in a pretty well-known film called 633 Squadron, because obviously they'd been maintained into the 60s in a highly, in a good maintenance way. TA-719, which is on the roof of Duxford, I know because I restored it or helped restore it. That was that. The reason why a lot of people don't like the colours she's in because it's a TT-35 scheme, but when we were restoring planes back then for the IWM, they wanted to do the original colours, and she never wore any Bomber Command or Fighter Command, Strike Command colours. She was always a target tug. Hence, that's why she's in that scheme today. But a number of airframes exist from that time.
The last military use of a mosquito in combat wasn't with the Royal Air Force. It was by the Israeli Air Force in the Suez campaign of 1956. They had acquired a lot of mosquitoes from the French Air Force at second hand and other sources, and eventually they'd formed some strike and photo reconnaissance units. They just retired the mosquito in early 1956 when the Suez crisis broke and eventually hostilities broke out, and they brought the mosquitoes back out of retirement and armed them, and they conducted operations against the town of Sharm el-Sheikh quite successfully during that particular conflict. So yeah, that was the last use of an armed mosquito.
And how many survive today? How many are flying?
Flying is easy. There are actually currently 2 flying, shortly to be joined by a third, and hopefully RL249 won't be too far behind.
Chaps, before we look at the People's Mosquito, if we could just take a minute to talk about Hillsdale College, who are supporting this episode of the podcast. If you're interested in the war, you're interested in Winston Churchill. Our friends at Hillsdale College have a new online course focusing on the great man. Winston Churchill and Statesmanship aims to explore his life and times and see what lessons we can learn for our lives today. You can find details at hillsdale.edu, that's .edu/WW2podcast. It's an online course, so you can do it in your own time. I do online courses all the time. I find it's a great way to learn. Sometimes I'll do a lot in one night, and other times I'll spread a week's lectures out over a number of days. It's self-paced. So, for exclusive access to Hillsdale College's Winston Churchill and Statesmanship, go to hillsdale.edu/WW2podcast. So, the People's Mosquito, what are you aiming to achieve?
Okay, what we want to return the Mosquito to British sky where it belongs. You know, many people have no idea, never seen a mosquito fly. We want to change that. I think the important thing for us is to remember how important an aircraft it was to us, and I think that is almost forgotten. Eric Wrinkle-Brown described the three most important aircraft that we had during the war as the Spitfire, the Lancaster, and the Mosquito. And in his words, the Mosquito more important than the others for its versatility. And I think this has been forgotten. We want to remind people of that. This was one of the most important tools we had at our command during the war. If we can use the opportunity of flying a Mosquito to remember all those who were involved in its design and its manufacture and its maintenance and its career in the air, then that's what we want to do.
Everybody that works for us is doing this on a voluntary basis. It's all in our own time. But our aims are to fly, to educate, and to remember. This is not about somebody owning a very expensive plane and showing it off. This is a project which is a heritage project, which is to remember our past but to influence our future. So our education bit is also about trying to inspire young people into aviation. Britain has got an absolute fabulous track record when it comes to aviation engineering, and we think the Mosquito can be a heritage project that inspires people from tomorrow.
You have an airframe, don't you?
We have what's known as the mortal remains. Some parts of that will be utilised, some you can't utilise. The rest of it will be constructed either here in the UK or in New Zealand. Currently, if you want to build a Mosquito or refurbish one, you have to start in New Zealand. That's because the only set of moulds in the world for the fuselage exist there. They're built by a gentleman called Glyn Powell. They're in mahogany, as the original moulds were, though de Havilland's later established you could make them in concrete, believe it or not. So if you want a new fuselage, you've got to go to New Zealand.
So what's the process in New Zealand?
As I mentioned, that the only set of moulds there for the fuselage are down there. There are also a full set of jigs for the main wing spar, which is nearly 50 feet long, by the way, made of laminated Canadian spruce. They have sourced Canadian spruce to such a high quality it's equivalent to that used during the war from Canada, and they can build all the wood components. They have sources of spares because after the war the New Zealand Air Force bought and acquired Mosquitoes from the UK and other sources and ran them themselves for a while. And the New Zealand CAA have now successfully cooperated in getting a Mosquito into the air, and there are more coming. So that's why we actually have to start in New Zealand. But we'll be shipping things like engines, props, hubs, and other components from the UK to mate up with the wooden components in New Zealand. Then the idea is that it will be completed, fitted out, test flown in New Zealand, put on the New Zealand Civil Register, for that process to take place, and then exported to the UK on export category C of A.
How difficult are they to reconstruct now? I mean, do all the plans survive? And how do the plans for the jigs and the other specialty equipment to even make the aircraft themselves survive?
Plans exist. Some of them exist in Canada. We managed to turn up through a cooperative organisation that's been set up the drawings for what's known as Mod 683, which strengthens the front of the wing spar. They came from an organisation in Canada. Some drawings exist in Australia, some exist here in the UK. There are enough drawings from various sources to enable you to actually do this. And there's been a reconstruction of a bomber version of B-35 in British Columbia by Victoria Air. An absolutely beautiful rebuild. And there's also this Canadian, an FB-26, which is roughly equivalent to an FB-6, that's been rebuilt and is now flying successfully with the fighter factory in Virginia Beach in the USA.
I presume it'll be heavy. There won't be a lot of the original aircraft left in when you rebuild. Are you forced to compromise on materials now?
Goodness, no. In some respects, although you have to clear every change of material with the relevant authorities, either the New Zealand Civil Aviation Authority or the Civil Aviation Authority in the UK, modern materials have moved on. For example, our contractor in New Zealand is guaranteeing the wood glue joints for 70 years. Modern technology allows you to carefully analyze what you're doing. For example, many of the wood components will be laser cut to an accuracy that World War II builders couldn't even dream of. And Nick will tell you that we're actually starting to cut wood, aren't we, Nick?
Yeah, some of the wing ribs have been completed now down in New Zealand, so production is ongoing.
Do you have a couple of Merlins?
We can source a couple of Merlins. Indeed, we have quotations in for Merlins and propeller hubs and propellers, propeller blades, I should say. So things are turning up all over the place. We were gifted only the other week with a new, i.e. unused as far as they're concerned, cabin heater. And you might say, well, what's a cabin heater? Well, the answer is, as far as the Mosquito is concerned, it's a vital part of its anatomy, because that cabin heater, along with a radiator and an oil cooler, were bolted together onto a tray and formed the inner portion of the wing leading edge of the Mosquito on the starboard side.
It's funny how when word gets out about things, people who are interested suddenly discover things that they've had for a long time and they don't quite know what to do with it. So we've got this. Are you interested? They've been resting in garages and sheds, and it's amazing what's hidden away.
Yeah, we were contacted. A couple do a kind of like an internet eBay business, and sadly one of their family members had passed away. And they were funnily enough, they were clearing through the garage, and I think the gentleman had been a bit of a collector of aviation memorabilia. The guys in question remembered that before he passed, that he'd sold some seat cushions to the FB-6, which is flying in the United States, KA-114. That's owned by Jerry Yeagan and his fighter factory company, and they were clearing out a way, and of course they came across our website and our sort of PR machine, etc. And I contacted them, and they said, they'd been looking through some things and found another box of seat covers, brand new, in box, sealed, wrapped in sort of like wax paper, and then wrapped again in another box, things like that, as made in the factory. And when I went to collect it, they were very, very kind and said, "Oh, we found some hub covers and prop covers. Would you like to have these as well?" And they donated it. So I think as we get more and more exposure to the public and your listeners on the case, if you're not sure, just contact Ross. And I say Ross because he can pick out a Mosquito part from about 6,000 miles away. As an aside, Angus, wooden components can be made. Everything wood can be made new. and we know what and the suppliers in New Zealand can do that. What's actually going to be an appeal from us is the more lesser known metal parts. The Mosquito did actually carry about 20% of its thing is metal. So you got the cockpit frame, you got all the elevators were all ailerons were all made out of metal, things like that. But it's more the things that you don't really think about, things like hinges and, for example, the hinges and bolts that sort of like secure the cannon bay and things like that. These things are quite rare. Even if you find an old battered something, at least reverse engineering it, we could get some new ones made and things like that. Yeah, the metal parts are actually going to be something we'll put an appeal out for.
Someone's probably sat with a garage with a jam jar stuffed full of hinges and nuts and bolts that have just been there since 1945. Do you have a projected completion date?
That will depend very much on the rate of donations, actually. That it's simply that. As far as timescale, we're at the moment looking 5 to 8 years. That could change either way, depending on the amount or the rate rather that we can raise donations. And
if people want to help, how can they get involved?
Well, the first port of call is our website, www.peoplesmosquito.org.uk. There is a donate page on there. There are many ways people can donate, from monthly payments to a direct payment into our bank via PayPal or however they want to do it. We will be launching within the next month or so a membership club, and details of that will be on the website and on Facebook and Twitter as that becomes as we get nearer to that.
Your patron, Eric Winkle-Brown, has sadly recently passed away. I wonder if you'd like to say a few words about him.
Eric, during his short time with the People's Mosquito, just over 18 months, he had a profound effect upon us with his unerring effervescence, really positive, always got an amusing story, but also he had massive technical knowledge and ability that we will never see again. He flew the record number for the number of aircraft flown, 487. He also made the highest number of carrier deck landings at 2,407. And one was famously of these carrier landings was the first Mosquito in March 1944 on a heavily modified fighter bomber 6. And, which was a feat in itself because he had to land the Mosquito below its stalling speed, yet he did that, and he went on to prove that it could be done time and time again. So it was a world's first, as well as the first twin heavy aeroplane to land on an aircraft carrier. Not only was a highly decorated test pilot, he was also a very highly decorated World War II fighter pilot as well, and not many people know that he served in the Royal Navy Fleet Air Arm and was very lucky to survive the sinking of his aircraft carrier during the early part of World War II. But also Eric saw the extremes of World War II, and because of an association of being based in Germany pre-war and a good understanding of the German language, he was sent into Europe to capture the Luftwaffe technology, to evaluate it. And during this time, he witnessed the liberation of Bergen-Belsen, an event which never left him, and for which he likes to remind the world why we fought that war. An absolute loss to mankind and the aviation industry, and our condolences go to his friends, his family, and his loved ones. So thank you, sir, and blue skies, and rest in peace.
That's sad news indeed. And with that, I think we'll leave it there. Ross, John, Nick, I'll be following your progress eagerly. Now, that was a few weeks ago, and things have been moving forward for the People's Mosquito, and John sent me through this brief update.
I am pleased to announce that the People's Mosquito has achieved its registered charity status with the number of 1165903. So this is a great achievement for the team, and it's taken us several years to achieve this status to the standard that the Charity Commission requires. And this is an absolute vote of confidence in the project, and people can also be assured that every penny that we raise will go into the successful restoration and return to flight of a Mosquito aircraft, an absolute vital piece of missing aviation history and heritage. In addition to this, in our other good news, we've also been able to register with the CAA the registration mark of G, Foxtrot Bravo Victor India. So Foxtrot Bravo Victor India. We registered GFBVI. And for those of you that know mosquitoes, know that's the Fighter Bomber Mark 6 version. And that is our desired aircraft type that we will return to the skies.
For more information on the People's Mosquito, in case you missed it, you can go to peoplesmosquito.org.uk. There you'll find plenty of information on the project and how to support them. And don't forget, have a rummage. Do you have any unidentifiable bits that could be of use to the project tucked away? They would love to hear from you if you do. I'll post the links on the website, www.podcast.com, and on the Facebook page. Hopefully we can check in with them again and see how they're getting on. Well, that wraps it up for this episode. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.